Chapter 7 Serious Trouble. It had been raining on and off all that day, so we stayed in the Te Waio Tu Kapiti hut, burning a big pile of tawa branches we'd thrown down out of the bush. Uncle Heck was cutting up the last of the mutton to add to a stew, and I was rereading The Thorn Birds. The main sound was the rain spattering onto the roof through trees. It was cozy and peaceful. One of the dogs barked once, and suddenly 3 big young men were standing in the hut, dripping water. 2 of them had rifles with telescopic sights, and it wasn't cozy and peaceful anymore. My main thought was how different from us they looked. I could smell some kind of scented soap off them. They dropped their packs on the floor and introduced themselves. Hugh, Joe, and Ron, all National Park Rangers, checking the tracks and huts in the area. "Stinks in here," the one called Ron said, looking up and down us. We didn't say anything. They got out mugs and filled them from our billy over the fire and had tea, sitting on the edges of the bunks. The one called Hugh seemed to be their leader. "You two are supposed to be over in the Waioka," he said. "First I heard of it," said Uncle Heck. "You were seen over there about a month ago." "No kidding." "Come on, old man, we know who you are. You're Faulkner and this is Baker. We knew we'd pick you up sooner or later. That a fact. You're caught, you might as well admit it. What are you going to do about it?" "We'll have to take you out to the base, of course." "Why?" "Because you're wanted, that's why." "Who wants us?" "The police, that's who." "You're not the police." "No, we are Park Board Rangers." "Then you don't want us." "Not us personally, we've got nothing against you. We know the guy you looked after at the Coronga Forks. We are all grateful to you for that." "Leave us alone then." I could tell they had no intention of leaving us alone. These heroes were going to bring us in and give us to the Social Welfare Department and the police, no matter what we said or did. "You're just making it tougher on yourselves," the one called Hugh went on. "The longer you keep up this attitude, you'll only make it worse." "You're the worst thing that's happened to us for months," Uncle Heck told him. "Well, you've had your bit of fun. You can come out with us in the morning and get it over with. We'll be coming out when we are ready. We don't want to tie you up, old man, but we will if we have to. If you try sneaking away, we'll tie you and young Baggy Britches here to a tree until we're ready to march you out to the road. The party's over, old man," and he grinned around at his mates. The one called Joe took our .22 off a bunk, checked it, and put it with theirs behind the door. "What do you shoot with this thing, sparrows?" They laughed. I didn't like these men. They were casual about us, as though we were already locked up. It looked as though it was the end of the party all right. Even Uncle Heck could see how hopeless it was. He sat on the edge of a bunk and said nothing, while the Rangers muttered among themselves, not really caring if we heard or not. The one called Ron wanted to tie us up, but the other 2 said to wait unless we made it necessary. "They are harmless," one of them said, and still Uncle Heck didn't say anything. Whenever either of us moved, one of them would shift between us and the door. If we had to go outside, 2 of them came with us. We were prisoners. They took it in turns to sit by the door in front of the rifles, in case we tried making a run for it. When I climbed into my sleeping bag that night, topping and tailing with Uncle Heck on the same bunk, I couldn't sleep for hours. I was worried as I'd ever been and wished that something really nasty would happen to those rangers, like a meteorite crashing through the roof of the hut and breaking all their legs. I must have gone to sleep in the end, because the next thing I heard was Uncle Heck calling out my name. I sat up, and so did the 3 rangers. The one in the chair by the door was the last to wake up. It was just getting light. Uncle Heck called out again from outside. "Ricky." "What?" I yelled back, getting out of my sleeping bag. "Get out here." I knew something critical was on, as did the rangers. I went to the door, and they crowded behind me, a big hand grabbing me above my elbow and holding me there. It had stopped raining, and the whole valley was sodden and soaked in mist. Uncle Heck was standing by the woodblock with the .22 in one hand. "Grab our packs and load 'em up, Ricky. We are snatching it from here, and if one of those blokes touches you, yell out and get under the end of the bunk quick." "He's mad," muttered one of the rangers, and I had to agree it looked like it. Uncle Heck can look very hot round the eyes when he gets in that mood of his. "You boys just keep out of our way. Anyone touches one of us gets it." The grip round my arm slid away. "You've done it now," the one called Hugh said. "You realize—" "I know what I'm doing, Sonny. You just keep right out of the way and you won't get hurt. Ricky, move it." I ducked round them into the hut and started stuffing our gear into the packs. No one tried to stop me. They were still standing at the door, talking to Uncle Heck, so I scooped a few cans of their food into our packs. "You wouldn't shoot us," the one called Joe said. "You just try me, young feller," said Uncle Heck. "You're easier to hit than a sparrow. I'd drop you before you could move." I didn't like going too near him, but I lugged our packs in his direction. "Get the dogs." I untied them, and we picked up our packs and moved away downstream, looking back to make sure they didn't come after us. "What have you done with our rifles?" one of them shouted. "Under the hut," called back Uncle Heck. "And if any of you try following us, you'll deserve what you get." "You'll never get away with this," the one called Hugh yelled after us, and then we were out of sight and them and free again. 2 crossings down the river, we climbed up onto a bush spur, dropped our packs, tied up the dogs, and sat against a tree for a while. I was still shaky. When we'd had a spell, we sidled back past the hut, up in the bush, and found a place in some ferns where we could watch the main track out to the road. "What happens now?" I said. "It could get a bit tricky for a while. My bet is that they'll head straight out and raise the alarm." "Would you have shot them?" I couldn't help asking. "Hard to say." "Shut up. They're due past here any time now." About half an hour later, the 3 rangers came up the track and passed by 30 feet below. They weren't trying to follow us, but you could tell by their faces and the way they were half running that Uncle Heck and I were in trouble with other people again. Serious trouble this time. When they had gone, we went back to the hut and took all the food and books it could spare and carried them in a sack to where we'd left our packs and dogs. Then we climbed up through the dripping bush onto the Pukapohu Range and camped that night on a flat rock by the Manganuihau River on the other side. Next morning, right on daylight, it started. Choppers swept up and down the valley, slapping across the treetops, and others came and went, dropping people off at various vantage points. It was as well for us that there weren't many places where they could land, but we had to be particularly careful of the choppers because we knew some of them had infrared gear that could pick up an animal or a person, so we had to stay in deep bush, the tall timber. We never used to put more than 3 or 4 bullets in the magazine of a rifle at once, but this day Uncle Heck put the full 15 in and stuck a handful of extra ones in his pocket, so I knew we were in for a heavy day. I was scared. We worked our way round to a ridge that would take us further away from most of the activity, and after a couple of hours we were just coming up onto the crest of the ridge when we became suspicious. The birds were too quiet. We stopped to listen, and we just looked at each other to see whether we should move on when we heard a radio crackle and hiss up on the ridge and someone call out, "I'm over here." We knew there was more than one of them, so we sidled away through the bush and tried the only direction we had left. It can make you nervous hiding day and night. We had to stay super quiet and couldn't talk above a whisper for days and nights. Every now and again we walked for a few minutes up a side creek and then doubled back in the water in case they were tracking us with dogs. Willie and Zag must have thought we were crazy that day, as they weren't even allowed to chase nice fat pigs that jumped up right in front of us. We heard some shots and shouting out on our left on another ridge and eased away from there. The main search seemed to be concentrated over in the Waiau and Tahoe valleys, and it looked as though they'd guessed we'd gone that way. But then they swung round in a wide circle and surrounded us. We were cut off from the main part of the Urwara. This was serious. We stashed some of our load where we could find it again, and set off on a mad game of hide-and-seek through 25,000 hectares of bush and streams and ridges and slips and waterfalls and cliffs. For 3 days we dodged them back and forth across the watershed, using Uncle Heck's strategy of sticking around to keep an eye on what everyone else was up to. There was always the chance that we might try it once too often, and that we might be caught any moment, any hour. They had dogs this time too. We'd heard them bark a few times. The dogs must have known we were still around there somewhere, but they kept losing our trail because we kept them a mile behind us, running up and down false trails. "Them kind of dogs can't wind find in the bush," whispered Uncle Heck. "They have to track you." So we formed a pattern and used it every now and then, especially if we heard any barking close by. We'd look at each other, nod, and then split up and go in opposite directions, round into a side creek and back to the main stream, walking in the water. The scent of our dogs only seemed to add to the confusion behind us. When we needed a rest, we'd climb up into a steep creek head somewhere and rest up, listening to make sure they didn't come too close. There were certainly plenty of people and choppers and dogs. It took them only a few minutes to pick people up and drop them right over on the other side of the watershed, so they could get from behind us to in front of us before we could move 200 meters. They only needed to sight us once and surround us, but they were so clumsy and noisy in the bush that we could always tell where they were. Some of them actually shouted out to one another. "They couldn't track an elephant through 6 feet of snow, those clowns," whispered Uncle Heck, looking down at the bushes thrashing around down in the gully, where someone seemed to be getting tangled up in the supplejack. But the people waiting on the ridges with radios were a bigger worry. Twice we smelt cigarette smoke and had to bird lady it in a wide circle around them. They still should have caught us. One evening we were looking for somewhere to camp on a bush flat along the bottom of a ridge, and we heard these two bushmen thumping and cracking and snapping in their big boots down the ridge. We stood in a clump of pepperwoods and watched them come tripping and fumbling down the ridge and onto the flat. They stopped about 40 meters away in the trees, and started talking loud about which way to go. One of them had a rifle and the other a radio on his belt. They were arguing. They were lost. Suddenly, a vine I must have been half standing on flicked up and hit Willie on the nose. He yelped. "What was that?" said one of the bushmen. "I didn't say anything," said the other one, and they took off through the bush, no doubt to spend the night in the open because the hut they were looking for was nearly 2 hours in the other direction, but that's how alert they were. We ate everything we had with us. It was cold, with no fires and no tea. We slept curled up in our bags in the roots of totara and rata trees. They're the warmest. It can make you very tired and hungry living like that, and we were very relieved when the search spread out and away from us, deeper into the Urwera. Uncle Heck was right. They didn't think we'd be game to stick so close to where we'd been caught. They thought we must have got through to the main part of the Urwera. On the fourth day we came up out of the tall timber and pushed and pulled each other and the dogs up onto the Coteau Ridge, up a tricky gully. We didn't want to try leading ridges because they were still too dangerous. We picked our way towards the southern end of the bush, away from most of the activity. It was real bird lady sneaking. Uncle Heck went in front and I kept him just in sight through the bush. The cover got a bit scattery in places, and we had to dive for it whenever we heard a chopper come too close. They had a habit of coming suddenly up over a ridge or round a corner, and they could be on you before you knew what was happening, if you didn't watch out. I'd never been so nervous of a patch of open ground in my life. We traveled along the Coteau for 2.5 hours. Heading for a place Uncle Heck knew about from when he'd hunted goats there in '66, but he was having trouble remembering exactly how to get there. After casting around for a while, we found a place, all second-growth manuka and grassy clearings, with shelved bluffs and rocky slips, where we could get over the side. We kept to the high ground and came out on a wide shelf where the bluff fell away to open sheep country. We could see anything coming for miles up there, and there were 3 directions of escape. We made our camp under a big, dry overhang of rock, almost a cave, and by dark that night we were invisible behind a wall of rocks and scrub. "The only thing we can do now is wait," said Uncle Heck. "When they've burnt themselves out looking for us in there, we'll get back over to the Rocketuri or somewhere." We saw 2 lots of 4-wheel drive vehicles go up the valley next morning and come back out again in the evening. There was a lot of chopper activity, but none came near. It looked as though we had them tricked. It was a good place all right. We called it Cave Camp. We ate a lot of hares there when it was safe to shoot, and there were 2 different mobs of goats further round the bluff. There was a gully full of pig rooting half an hour up the Otoy side, and plenty of sheep down on the grass if we got desperate. We didn't like to steal sheep off the farmers around the edges of the bush because it would have turned them against us, and we had enough enemies as it was. But the mutton was always there as a backstop. There was no need to swipe mutton at Cave Camp, as it turned out. The worst thing was being stuck up there, not able to move around. We lay all day, reading and sleeping, and as soon as the last chopper had gone, passed down the valley, we could let the dogs off and come out into the open, where we could sit around the fire, eating and talking till the early hours of the morning. We could tell when they scaled down the hunt for us as though they'd told us. The choppers stopped blatting around all over the place, and the only ones left went straight up the valley and came out again with deer slung underneath. They weren't looking for people. The vehicles and people stopped going up and down the valley, and anyway, we knew without any of that. It felt different to walk around in the open in daylight. We were now low on food, so Uncle Heck made a trip back to the hut where we'd got caught, Te Waitukapati, and got back next day with a pack full of flour and tinned food, plus packets and sachets, a dozen eggs, a bottle of tomato sauce, and extra salt. He even brought some books. He'd also shot a deer just along the Coterre Ridge and hung it in a tree, so we had plenty to eat. Clearly, they'd been using the Te Waitukapiti hut as a base while they were looking for us, and they'd stocked it up well. Uncle Heck had stashed another load of food near the hut for next time. There was still untouched hunting around us, and we had plenty of time to sort out the camp. We put in a punga screen, disguised it with ferns, and built our fire so that the smoke went up the face of the bluff and you couldn't tell it from the mist, if there was any of that about, which was just about every morning. We built our bunks up with mingy vines till they were like my inner sprung back at the farm. We collected our water from a spring in a clump of fern 30 meters round the base of the bluff, and there was more dead manuka around than even Uncle Heck could burn. The only bad thing about cave camp was that it was so high up, you always had to climb up to it with whatever you'd caught or shot. It was a long drag at the end of the hunt, but it was worth it once you were up there. When it was time to go back to Te Waitukapiti for more supplies, we both went, taking the dogs and the books to exchange. We tied the dogs on the ridge above the hut and went down to find no one around. They'd stocked up the hut again. There were candles, which we were short of, and tins of peas and cheese and meat and puddings, plus an unopened 10-kilogram bag of self-raising flour, but only one book this time. Uncle Heck showed me where he'd stashed the other stuff, in a hole under a big rata's roots, so we added more to it and left it there for next time. Then we each carried a good load home, and there was still plenty left, a good hut that. We returned to cave camp in the dark, and had a big meal of stewed apricots with condensed milk and tins of chocolate pudding. Everything tastes good when you've been walking for 9 hours across the Coterre. It's what Uncle Heck called a gut buster. We soon got to know all the country where everything was for hours in every direction from cave camp, except the farmhouse you could see down in the valley from the end of the bluff. Someone was living down there, but he or she never came up our way, and we'd given up worrying about them. Then we went and got caught again. This is how it happened. We'd been down at the river doing some washing, and we were climbing up one of our main tracks back to cave camp when we came across a set of horses' hoof prints going straight up towards the camp. Shod hoof prints. I was getting ready to run for it, but Uncle Heck said to hold it, so I held it, and we sneaked up and had a look. A horse with a saddle on was feeding outside the cave, and a man with a woolly hat was leaning there. We watched him for a while. He was a big young man, a clean one, the sort that always meant trouble for us. Then Uncle Heck stood up. "Come on," he said. "We'll go and see what he wants. We've got a gun, and he hasn't." I was shaky with apprehension as we walked over to meet the stranger. Every time something like this happened, our lives tended to take a violent swerve in another direction. There was sadness, too. We'd got to like our cave camp. It was safe and comfortable and easy living. But because this man was standing there, it could never be any of those things to us anymore. "G'day," said Uncle Heck. "Hello there," said the man, smiling a bit. "What brings you up here?" he asked Uncle Heck, leaning the rifle against the rock. "Seeing as we've been neighbors for the past few weeks, I thought it was about time we got acquainted." "My name's Rob Barton. They call me Robbie." He shook hands with Uncle Heck, and I moved out of the way and started pushing the embers of the fire together in case he tried to shake hands with me too. "This your place here?" asked Uncle Heck. "No, I'm caretaking the place for the stock and station agents. It's a bankrupt sheep station, and I'm keeping it more or less running till they decide what they want to do with it." "How long have you known we were here?" "Since a few days after you got away from the park board boys," he said. "Anyone else know we're here?" He shook his head. "Only me. I'm on my own down there. How did you find us?" "Don't worry, it was a sheer fluke. I was looking across the bluffs to see where the goats were. I use them for dog tucker sometimes, and I spotted your mate here and his dogs digging a possum out of the flax up on the shelf there. They still had the big search on at the time, so I left you alone until it died down. You're safe enough now, though. You were supposed to have broken into a bok over on the Teakaha coast a couple of days ago. I'm pretty sure no one suspects you're anywhere near here." "You know we are here," pointed out Uncle Heck. "That's not no one. If I was going to turn you in, I'd have done it before this," he said. "Look, how would you two like to come down to the homestead for a meal and a bath? I've just got some food in, and you look as though you could do with a clean-up and a change of clothes." "No thanks, mate," said Uncle Heck. "We're okay the way we are. We'd appreciate it if you'd give us a day or two to get well away from here, that's all." "Okay, suit yourself," the man called Robbie said. "But I've got some information you ought to know." "What?" "I'll tell you in private. You can say anything you like in front of my mate," said Uncle Heck. "There's a price on your head." Even the horse stopped eating and looked up. "How much?" said Uncle Heck. $2,500 for information leading to your apprehension. There's already been a few parties gone in looking for you, hoping to pick up the reward. They carry two-way radios to call up the choppers if they spot you. You've been classified as dangerous, not to be approached. What are they accusing us of?" "Abducting a minor and presenting a firearm to facilitate escaping from lawful custody. They're the main ones. They're treating the firearm one pretty serious. You lost quite a bit of public support over that." "What do you mean, public support?" "Well, when you chaps first took to the bush, a lot of people took your side. Didn't you know about that?" "No, what else?" "Well, when you saved that ranger's life over at the Karenga Forks, you became kind of heroes. The paper made a big thing of that. Was he a bloody ranger?" Uncle Heck and I looked at each other, not really hearing what the man called Robbie went on saying. "In a diabetic coma. They only just saved him. A lot of people took your side after that. Some pretty high-up types, too. They were all saying you should be left alone, and they were wasting public money looking for you. I don't believe any of this, but go on." When you pulled the rifle on those park board rangers, they declared you dangerous. They called in the armed offenders squad, police with tracker dogs, the Army Iroquois crowd. They even recruited members of the public. Some of their best bushmen and hunters were on the job for a while. The forestry had men with radios in half the huts, and the Uruwara, none of them came up with any confirmed sightings. But you were supposed to have been seen all over the place. It's died right down just lately. A lot of people have been saying you're being hunted like animals and that sort of thing. You've still got a fair bit of public sympathy. It's a bit hard to believe some of that, said Uncle Heck, but thanks anyway. I've kept all the newspaper cuttings I've come across lately, said the man called Robbie, reaching over to pick up his horse's reins off the ground before climbing into the saddle. I'll put an extra potato in the pot in case you feel like coming down to the house tonight. You ought to have a look over those newspaper cuttings before you take off from here. But if you don't want to, you needn't worry about me telling anyone about you. I don't operate that way. Thanks, what did you say your name was, mate? Robbie, I reminded him, speaking for the first time in front of the stranger. Well, thanks, Robbie, said Uncle Heck. We'll think it over and come down after dark if we decide to. Okay, I'll expect you if you turn up. In any case, good luck. He rode off over the ridge, and about 20 minutes later we saw him ride like an ant out across the riverbed and disappear towards the red roof of the homestead. We had either to trust that little dot down there or move away somewhere else. He seems to know a fair bit about us, said Uncle Heck. Some of it might just be useful if they're that anxious to get their hands on us. What if it's a trap, I asked. All that stuff about a reward on our heads and that, I don't believe it. It could easily be true, said Uncle Heck. I know blokes like that. What's his name again? Robbie, I told him. Like that Robbie, and I don't reckon he'd put us crook. I'm inclined to think he's straight up. What if he's not? That's the risky bit. What do you reckon? We talked it over for a while and decided to risk it. I don't know about Uncle Heck, but it was an apprehensive decision as far as I was concerned. If other people didn't leave us alone, I was going to flatten one of them one of these days. Our cave camp was blown now. Chapter 8. Another Notch. But a lot happened to us that night. We sneaked up on Robbie's farmhouse in the evening, and as soon as we were out in the open grass country, it felt as if the whole world had changed. It was so bare everywhere, hardly a tree in sight, and nowhere to hide. I would have been quite happy if Uncle Heck had changed his mind, and we'd turned back to cave camp. Naked, eh? He whispered, when we were getting over the fence behind the woolshed. That's just what it feels like when you go out into the open after hiding in the bush for a year and 7 weeks, naked. We tied our dogs in the woolshed yards and whistled out from near the house, and Robbie came out and took us inside, into the brightest light at night I could remember. It took a while to get used to. We sat around the kitchen table and enjoyed the warmth while Robbie made us cups of tea. We could tell that no one else was around and started to relax. Robbie took a small pile of stuff torn out of newspapers from a drawer in the kitchen, and we started to read. It was hard to believe those newspaper reports were about us, probably because we didn't know exactly what had been happening. It had been a big search all night, just as Robbie had said. You could tell they'd expected to round us up in the first day or two, and you could also tell they hadn't been very happy about not succeeding. One search coordinator had said it was highly unlikely that Faulkner and Baker could survive in the bush without outside help. Then there were some letters and editorials saying how ridiculous it was for them to be spending all that money and effort in fruitless attempts to outwit a doddering old bush rat and a half-witted youth. Another interesting thing was that some of the journalists had declared that the park board rangers had no right to detain Baker in the Te Waio to Kapiti hut because there were no charges against him. One even suggested that Faulkner was within his rights to protect his nephew from being unlawfully detained, and no one could say whether the rifle had been loaded or not. The whole collection of articles added up to a load of garbage, but it certainly gave us our first inkling of what had actually been going on and what people were saying. We sat at the kitchen table and ate boiled beef and cabbage and bread and as much butter as we wanted. Uncle Heck and Robbie talked across the other end of the table. It was the first time I'd been inside a proper house since Auntie Bella died, and I didn't have much to say at first. After I'd done the dishes, Robbie said to help myself to a bath. You can use as much hot water as you like. There's tons of it. There's some clean clothes on the bed in that room there, if you feel like putting them on. They'll be a bit big for you, but they'll keep you warm. So I went and filled the bath, and just when I was getting into it, I saw my face in the mirror. I stopped and looked at myself because we hadn't seen a proper mirror since the farm. I was pulling a few faces at myself like you do, and then I noticed something. I looked at my body, then climbed on to the edge of the bath to get a better look in the mirror. I looked over my shoulder and turned around. I looked back at my front to make certain. There are some things you actually know about, but you don't like testing them in case it turns out not to be true. This was one of those things, and it was true. I wrapped a towel round my waist and ran out into the kitchen. Uncle Heck and Robbie looked round from where they were talking with a bottle of whiskey between them. "I'm thin," I shouted at Uncle Heck. They just sat there. "I'm thin," I said again. "Yeah, I know," said Uncle Heck. "I'm thin," I said. "You're not allowed to call me fat any more." "I don't," he said, drinking whiskey out of a teacup. "Haven't called you that for months." "Ever again," I said. Robbie was grinning, but I didn't care. "Depends if you get fat again," said Uncle Heck. "You're not fat, so you don't get called fat." "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. "I'm not fat any more, I'm thin." They were both laughing at me, but that didn't matter. Being thin can alter your whole outlook when you're used to being a fat person. I went back into the bathroom and put my thin self into the bath and had a big, thin soak. I even washed my hair, a thin person's hair. I was thin all right, thin face, thin stomach and legs and bum. Thin arms and hands. I was bony. And one of the main things I felt at the time was resentment about how long I must have been thin without realizing it. I climbed into Robbie's jeans and big red woolly shirt. It was all a bit loose for a thin person like me, but the socks nearly fitted. When I came out into the kitchen, Uncle Heck and Robbie were deep into talk about what it was like round there in the early days. I sat there listening to Uncle Heck talking more than I'd ever heard him, and exploring my ribs with my fingers through Robbie's red woolly shirt. I must have been yawning because Robbie showed me where to sleep, in the room where the clothes were. There were 2 beds there, very clean looking, with sheets and all that. I didn't like to get in the sheets, so I left my clothes on and got under the top 2 blankets. Out in the kitchen, Uncle Heck and our new friend laughed sillier and sillier with the whiskey, and then I slept thin. We were used to staying awake at night, but Uncle Heck wasn't used to whiskey, and when he finally staggered his way to bed, shouting out to ask if I was asleep or not, he had to get up again immediately and be sick out of the window. I didn't mind I was thin, like Uncle Heck. We stayed at the sheep station with Robbie for nearly 2 weeks. The first day we helped him put 2,000 ewes through the spray dip. He'd been wanting to get that done, and it was too much for one man on his own. Robbie had 4 dogs, black and tan ones, and they weren't bad, Uncle Heck said, but Willie and Zag were easily as good as any he had. "You blokes have got great control over those dogs of yours," said Robbie, when we were having a brew of tea and a spell at the sheep yards. "Never seen anything like it. You have to have 'em like that when you live the way we do," said Uncle Heck. "How about seeing what you can do with that bitch pup of mine, Heck? She's a well-bred thing, and she ought to be working by now, but I can't do a thing with her." "I'll have a look at her," said Uncle Heck, and a few days later he had the little black and tan bitch, dream of all names, working to the whistle like a champion. "That uncle of yours is the best man with dogs I've ever seen," said Robbie. One day when we were watching Uncle Heck away up the hill on a horse, bringing in 250 wethers with the help of Dream on her own. "He's a good shot as well," I told him, feeling proud of him. Uncle Heck and Robbie shod all the station horses, 8 of them, and I fixed up the fowl run and rounded up all the chooks. Robbie thought we were great workers, but we were really having a good time doing ordinary things. It was like a holiday. It rained one day, and we sat round in the kitchen talking. Robbie had spent a few years at Lincoln College and had managed several big sheep and cattle runs around the back country. He had a wife and two kids, girls, living with her parents in town so the kids could go to school. He used to go in and see them in his old Land Rover most weekends, and when he left us alone, we were worried until he came back alone the following night. He brought a load of stuff for us: boots, socks, pants, shirts, and a new knife for me, as my old one was worn down to a spike, 200 rounds of .22 ammo, and quite a bit of other stuff. But the best of all was a transistor radio Robbie said had been lying around his in-laws' place with nobody using it, and a whole box of batteries. Uncle Heck and I were a bit embarrassed by Robbie's generosity. We'd agreed to let him buy us a pair of boots each till we could pay him, but the clothes and the radio and stuff were his idea. We knew he didn't have much money, and he was doing his best to help us. Uncle Heck and I had already discussed the need for some money to make life easier for us until I turned 15 in 9 months' time, and we owed Robbie over $300 already. "I keep thinking about those possums over in Rocketuri," said Uncle Heck. He didn't like calling it Broken Foot because it reminded him. "If they're like they were last winter, you wouldn't have to get many to whack up a decent check." So we made plans to trap possums at Broken Foot, up the other end of the Urwara, and pack the skins back to Robbie for him to sell for us. "I trap a few round here," he said. "Nobody'd notice if I take in a line of skins." He was so genuine about trying to get us to stay longer at the station, we had to make excuses to get away. If we were caught there, we'd all be in trouble, and we couldn't let Robbie risk it. Twice we'd had to duck away and hide in the woolshed when cars came up the road. It was time to move. "It's only about 6 weeks until the skins will be ready," said Uncle Heck. We'll need all that time to stock up the camp and get set up. Robbie loaded so much food and gear on us that we had to stash some of it when we got up to the cave camp. We stayed one night there to get our bush legs back and then headed off for Wakataka on the Huiara Range. On our way up through the middle of the Urwara, life was different now. The main thing as far as I was concerned was me being thin. I even walked thin these days, but there were other important changes as well. There was a price on us now. We were wanted for a serious crime, and a thing like that can alter every leaf and rock if you let it get to you. Then there was the fact that we had new boots and clothes, socks in proper pairs without holes, and our own singlets. It gives a man respect having a bit of decent gear. But the thing that made the biggest difference was the radio. Whenever we camped, one of the first things we did was unwrap the tranny, Uncle Heck still called it the wireless, and unwind the extra aerial Robbie had given us, which we'd hang in a tree and tune it to whatever we could get. Instant contact with the outside world. It was great to listen to music again. Uncle Heck hated missing the evening news, and he used to get impatient when we were a bit late reaching a camping place. We half ran down a long spur to a creek one night and just got tuned in time to hear ourselves being mentioned on the news. The Urwara fugitives, Hector Faulkner and his nephew Richard Baker, were reportedly sighted by a tramping party in the vicinity of the Te Puna hut on the shores of Lake Waikaremoana. Yesterday, a team of police with tracker dogs was flown into the area at first light, but no trace of the pair was found. The officer in charge of the operation, Sergeant Bowling of the Gisborne CID, told our reporter that he expected the pair to surrender themselves to the authorities by the time winter sets in properly in the mountains. Faulkner and Baker now faced their second winter in the bush. The pair have been at large now for 14 months and continue to frustrate all efforts to apprehend them. Anyone sighting them should not approach them, but inform the nearest police station. That was us they were talking about. 14 months, I said to Uncle Heck. That's a pretty long time. Seems longer than that to me, he said. We've been lucky so far, but we're going to have to be more careful than ever from now on. But in spite of us taking extra care, a nasty thing happened to us one day. We were sitting in the Te Porua hut when we heard a chopper coming low up the valley. We were always ready to move in a hurry, and we grabbed our stuff and were up in the bush when we heard it land at the hut. We climbed up a ridge and were about a third of the way to the top when we heard a dog bark behind us. Willie and Zag were a few yards out in front of us when we stopped and looked round. Rushing towards us was a big black Alsatian with a short lead hanging off it. It stopped to bark, then ran at us snarling. It was attacking us. I went over one side of the ridge and Uncle Heck went over the other. I was slithering and sliding and rolling down the slope with my pack up over my head, and as I grabbed something and was getting myself the right way up, a whole tangle of dogs, Willie and Zag and the Alsatian, came rolling down the side, snarling and ripping and tearing at each other. They went sprawling down past me and ended up in a muddy wallow. It was a fight to the death. Uncle Heck arrived, and all we could do was stand and watch. There was no way we could stop them. Your own dog'd take a hunk out of you if you went in there, said Uncle Heck, breaking off a branch and snapping it shorter under his boot. I did the same. The fight didn't last long. Soon Willie and Zag had the Alsatian beaten, and it was yodeling and gurgling and half drowning in the mud, with no fight left in it. We dragged our dogs off, and the Alsatian got onto its feet, staggering all over the place, and limped away through the bush, dragging one front leg and yelping every now and then. "He'll recover," said Uncle Heck, "but 2 of them might have been a different story. They're still tracking us down with dogs," I said. "Dangerous ones." "Yeah, one of the choppers must have spotted us around here yesterday and put the police onto us. We'd better get the hell out of here. They mightn't be too far behind that dog, and they might have more of them. They could easily have heard that racket." We slipped away up the ridge and hared it over into the rocketerie, where there was less chance of being disturbed, and where we worked out a plan in case we were attacked by police dogs again, straight up a tree, and if our dogs couldn't handle them, we'd just have to shoot them. "I sure hope we don't have to do that," I said. "So do I," said Uncle Heck. "I can't think of a better way to antagonize the police than to knock off a couple of their dogs, but if they attack me, I'll shoot 'em all right. Don't worry about that. Maybe they'll stop sending dogs after us when they see what happened to the one we sent them back. Start thinking that, and you'll have one of them Alsatians swinging off your arm before you know it. They were using dogs on us, big savage ones. The very thought of it cranked our trouble scale up another notch. Being tracked down by dogs is different than being hunted by choppers and other people. It makes you feel a sort of desperation whenever you think about it. Every creak of a branch in the wind becomes the bark you're half expecting all the time. Whenever we were separated from each other, we were even more worried. We made it our policy to keep out of the huts as much as possible, checking them out for supplies and moving on to camp in a different place, like a couple of old boars chucked out of the mob, Uncle Heck remarked. We packed a load of stuff into Broken Foot Camp. Our little ware was still there, and everything was just as we'd stashed it. We stripped all the dried-up thatching off the roof, retied the poles with nylon cord, and covered it with a sheet of polythene we carried from cave camp. Then we put down another layer of ferns, laid poles to hold it all down, and it was cozier than ever. It was like coming home. It was still too early for the possum skins to be at their best, but they were coming right, Uncle Heck said. Still a bit of mating damage on this one. We might have to give 'em a week or 2 yet. We spent our time packing supplies from everywhere within reach of Broken Foot. We had no intention of going hungry this time. We collected a line of traps that someone had sprung and left over in the Wakatane Valley. They were very rusty, but most of them still worked. We pulled the rusting staples out of the trees with a sharpening steel and packed the traps back to Broken Foot. 33 of them. We collected every nail and staple we could lever out of the walls of the huts, and took all the string and rope and wire and sacking and plastic, everything we could find, and lumped it all over to Broken Foot. We were busy round the camp for a few days, and by the time we were ready to start trapping, we had everything ready for the winter. Our food was stored in 2 wooden boxes between the bunks, with a candle and a tin on the top for reading in bed. The main stash of supplies remained under a rock across the bush flat, buried in plastic bags and tins. Sacks were useful. They provided the floor and the door and made good mattresses when stuffed with ferns on our bunks. Our spare clothes were stored under Uncle Heck's bunk, and our packs and dry firewood under mine. We even had a calendar from 2 years before hanging on the wall. It had a cow standing in a swamp on it. The slasher head we'd found the year before was one of the most useful things around. We'd put a short Kanuka handle in it and sharpened it with a file Robbie had given us. We cut all our pungas and ferns and light stuff with it. The flat back edge was our hammer, and the broad end of the blade was the best thing we had to dig with. One of the worst offenses around Broken Foot was hitting a rock and blunting the slasher. And of course, we had the radio. We couldn't get reception at Broken Foot in the daytime. Too many hills in the way, I suppose, but at night we could nearly always get the national program. This suited Uncle Heck all right, but the music they played was always yucky. We didn't hear ourselves mentioned on the news again, even after the police dog episode, but we reckoned it was more likely to have been on the local station, and we couldn't receive that where we were. No news was good news as far as we were concerned. How come everyone gets us wrong all the time, Uncle Heck? I asked him one night when we were sitting down looking into the fire. What do you mean? Well, every single time we have anything to do with other people, we get into more trouble. What about Robbie and Quiet Brian? They don't give us any trouble. Yes, they do, I said. How do you make that out? We can't stay near them or they'll get into trouble, and that means more trouble for us. But I mean those rangers and the police and the social welfare. Why can't we get them to leave us alone? They can't afford to leave us alone. But why? Because if they let us get away with living in here, they'd have to let anyone else who wants to, and most of them couldn't handle it. They'd get themselves straight into trouble and have to be rescued. Some of them get lost and die. The police can't afford to let it happen. They'd be mad if they did. You mean you agree with them? Uncle Heck loaded 2 more hunks of Mai Tai branch onto the fire. The police and me've got nothing against one another, he said. We just don't agree how to go about things, that's all. But the more we try to keep away from them, the harder they chase us, I said. Not just the police either, all of them. It's not fair. You're the one I can trust out of everyone. He looked at me and said, You don't want to go trusting people, mate. You'll only disappoint yourself if you do that. Then he mucked around with the fire a bit and said, Now shut up, will you? I'm trying to listen to the wireless. Hard to talk to sometimes, Uncle Heck. In fact, we hardly ever talked these days since we got the radio. At last, Uncle Heck pronounced that the skins weren't going to get much better than the ones we were catching around the camp for the dogs. They were very black and shiny, those furs, and I could see what he meant when he said they were unusually good ones. We set our 33 traps up a ridge to the top and down another one, with long spaces between each trap, so they could be shifted if they didn't catch. We put them on runs and against trees and roots and on logs. Wherever we found a good set and plenty of possum sign, we couldn't afford flour to bait our sets, so we used little scraps of white paper to attract them, which Uncle Heck said was as good as anything where the possum hadn't been trapped before. Uncle Heck could set the traps with his hands, but I had to put my foot on them and push the springs down. I couldn't wait to get out round the line next morning to see what we'd caught. 15 possums, 2 blue bush rats, and 2 sprung traps. We stunned the possums, bled them, and hung them up near the trap. 8 of them had real good skins, so Uncle Heck was pleased. Next day we got 8 more good skins, skinned the ones from the day before, and stretched the skins over pieces of driftwood and dead branch about as thick as your leg, if you've got thin legs like me. We hung them under a skin shelter on wires strung between 2 trees, and soon we had 50 of them in there. They all had to be opened out and scraped and shaken loose and hung in bundles. Uncle Heck was fussy about how we prepared the skins, and we only took the very best of them. In spite of several patches of dirty weather and having to shift the traps all around all the time to keep them catching, we ended up after 6 weeks with 288 dried, scraped, pressed, and bundled skins. Could be one of the best lines of skins I've seen, admitted Uncle Heck. We were low on food by this time because we'd been doing a lot of eating and not much hunting, so we stashed everything and humped our packs over to Mongapohatu on our way down to Cave Camp and Robbie's sheep station. Next day we climbed up onto the Huairao Range. We knew it had been snowing up there, and the snow was still lying around in big patches. In the distance it had looked as bright and clean as manuka flowers after rain, but close up it was slushy and wet with a crusty sound when you walked in it. Black pools of water lay in the hollows along the ridge, reflecting the treetops and the sky. There was not a sound except the scrunching of our feet on the saturated ground. They were good conditions for pretending to be fur trappers. Making our way across the frozen wastes to the trading post at Hudson Bay. We hadn't seen a single other person since we'd left Robbie 3 months before.